Welcome back to Understanding Human Development. We're on Chapter 7, Personality and Socio-Cultural Development in Early Childhood. So some of the things we're going to talk about in this lesson are fear and anxiety, emotional control. We're going to look at the development of aggressive behavior, pro-social behavior, feelings of social competence, and how does a child develop a sense of self, as well as the family dynamics and their effect on childhood development. And lastly, we're going to look at the cause and effects of child abuse on child development. There are three main theoretical perspectives when it comes to looking at childhood development. The first one was the psychoanalytic view established by Sigmund Freud. Freud was interested in how early childhood experiences affect lifelong development, and his followers, the psychoanalytic people, they would expound on this view. And they looked at children's feelings, drives, and development conflicts. In addition, they believed that young children must learn to cope with powerful emotions. So that's the psychoanalytic view. The social learning view they look at the links among cognition, behavior, and environment. And they believe that behavior is shaped largely by external rewards and punishments as well as role models. And so this links our behavior to the larger social environment. And the last view is a cognitive development view, and this focuses on children's thoughts and concepts. And they believe that these develop increasingly complex concepts as they get older. So let's start with looking at fear and anxiety. You want to be able to contextualize these in children. This is especially important to emotional development, and so that is their ability to cope with fear and anxiety, the feeling of uneasiness, apprehension, or fear that is a vague or unknown source. So fear is a state of arousal caused by a specific or identifiable situation, whereas anxiety is typically attributed to an unknown source. That's the difference between the two. You should be able to understand what is the difference. So there are some individual differences in how we express or we experience fearfulness and anxiety. Biological forces may underlie some of the aspects of fear and anxiety. So we can categorize fear and anxiety on the basis of temperament. Jerome Kagan found that 10 to 20% of children can be classified as behaviorally inhibited, meaning that they're shy children. And so this could be due to some kind of personality basis for anxiety. Or at least it would manifest itself as a kind of anxiety. So individual differences in how these things are expressed appear very early in life. And let's look at how culture and history and development influences how we experience fear and anxiety. So 100 years ago, people were afraid of wolves and bears. 50 years ago, there were fear of goblins and boogeymen. And today, people are more afraid of extraterrestrial creatures and killer robots. Why do you think the change in what people are afraid of? Well, it may have something to do with what the media or what their media focus on. For example, maybe 100 years ago, that was the literature of the time, what people are afraid of, or maybe they're out in nature more. Whereas 50 years ago, there may have been a lot of scary stories. Whereas today, there's more sci-fi and things like that. Also, culture can play a role. For example, and these are all, we're focusing on childhood fears. So obviously, adults may not be afraid of killer robots, but children may be. And so that could be due to the kind of media that we're surrounded by. Cultures can also play a role in what people are afraid of. So in Western tradition, showing fear is undesirable. According to the Navajo tradition, fear is healthy and normal. And so that's a good thing to recognize that fear is a normal part of human life, especially for children, that is, Now, there's also developmental influences. So it's seen that children's fear reflects their level of cognitive development. So the younger children fear specific things, whereas older children their fears are more abstract. Like maybe, not being like an adolescent might be afraid of not being accepted by their friends or something like that, or losing someone's love. So whereas younger children are more afraid of, um, you know, like specific phobias, like the boogeyman in the dark, that sort of thing. Okay, so children sometimes rely. And so some children, like I said, they can have temperaments that make them especially vulnerable to anxiety. So they might have irrational fears of parents leaving them, even in well-adjusted children, and they might have an anticipation of physical punishment. And fear and anxiety may be created by a child's imagination, such as rejection after they might be afraid of rejection when a newborn baby arrives. Anxiety can also result from the awareness of unacceptable feelings, such as anger at a parent or jealousy of a sibling. And they know that this is not acceptable, so they try to repress it, which can create anxiety. So, children sometimes rely on defense mechanisms, which are the psychodynamic tricks and behaviors used by individuals to disguise or reduce tensions that lead to their fear or anxiety. So, as I said, if they're uncomfortable with their anxiety, or they're uncomfortable with feelings, I should say, like jealousy or hurt, and not wanting to express that, they might get anxious trying to repress it. So that would be a defense mechanism. They're relying on the defense mechanisms to disguise or reduce those tensions. A commonly used defense mechanism is rationalization. This involves deluding oneself by creating reasonable but false explanations for events. So, for example, if parents are fighting, then they might attribute, they might want to blame themselves for what could be happening as a way to protect themselves from the potential fear that maybe, that things could get worse. And so a rationalization might create a reasonable explanation so that they don't have to face an even worse feeling. Repression is coping with threatening or traumatic thoughts or memories by refusing to consciously recognize them, instead pushing these events into the unconscious mind where they're hidden from conscious view. Some other common defense mechanisms are identification, denial, projection, as I mentioned, rationalization. Then there's reaction formation, regression to an earlier period, and withdrawal, emotionally withdrawing from another person. Parents can help children learn to cope with stress by serving as positive role models. Parents can also ease their fears by addressing the underlying cause with sensitivity. They might help them to learn to recognize and interpret their stress reactions, and they provide a warm, secure base for them to come to and talk about their feelings. And they can allow the children to discuss their feelings. And they may even temporarily allow immature behavior because they give them the space to grow, essentially. And they may help children give meaning to the events or circumstances by providing explanations that are appropriate to their age level. So parents help them to cope with stress by giving them some kind of thing to latch onto. So, for example, if a child has lost their parent, or let's say that the child's parent is not doing well, maybe they're dying, or maybe they left and they're not coming back. Well, the other parent may have to help the child to understand this, and they might have to give them explanations like, mommy's not feeling well and she's not going to get better, and she's going to be going away for a long time. Maybe they don't understand death necessarily, so they might have to try to explain it to them in a way that they understand. So emotional regulation is learning to deal with emotions in acceptable ways. And that's the primary task of children in early childhood. because they're going to go through a lot of emotions. This is a time, you've heard of terrible twos and terrible threes. This is a time when they have temper tantrums and they have to learn to control their emotions. So emotions and the ability to regulate them are closely linked to brain development, and the centers of emotional control shift too. So by age of 3 or 4, the control centers are in the frontal lobe. The control centers in the frontal lobe are more involved in emotional regulation. So that means that before this age, if a child had pain or they're hungry, they just cried. The emotional center was really in control. They're really driven by the limbic system. And so, if they need something, they cry. But by 3 or 4, the frontal lobe starts kicking in more, and they learn to start controlling their emotional reactions. In Freudian terms, he would say, well, the id was dominant. And then over time, the superego starts to develop. Well, that's like the emotional center of the brain versus the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe starts to kick in. So the development of emotional control is part of normal development in the first 8 years of a child's life. So they don't really develop their emotional control really until they're about 8 and 9 years old. Children also must learn to manage feelings of guilt when their behavior violates social norms, and shame, which feels even more intense and painful. And shame is, like I said, it's viewed as a very painful and intense emotion, and it's oftentimes tied directly to a child's sense of identity because it's a social emotion. If they feel shame, then it really feels personal. It's about themselves. Whereas guilt, on the other hand, is associated with a particular action or event. Shame says it is labeling this person. So it says something negatively about their whole identity. So guilt is specific, where shame is global. And unfortunately, when people feel shame, it's linked to aggression and can lead to anger and aggression. Meanwhile, cultural expectations affect the degree in which shame and guilt and pride are felt. So, they might feel like they can or they can't express these kinds of feelings. And it also affects how they demonstrate shame and what is acceptable ways of having or showing shame or not. Meanwhile, nevertheless, everybody experiences the same universal emotions. It's just a matter of how it's manifested in the culture. So every child is essentially learning to restrain their emotions. And so as I said, so they're learning to control their emotions, and they also have to learn to accept negative feelings. Acceptance of negative feelings is normal, while also learning to control or redirect their reactions to those negative feelings. So they need to know it's okay to get angry, it's okay to be sad, it's just what you do with it. And they also learn that even positive emotions must also be restrained. Like they can't always, 2-year-olds deal with spontaneous feelings very differently than 6-year-olds. A 2-year-old may show their happiness and joy very easily, whereas a 6-year-old might be more sensitive to issues, political issues about how and when that can be expressed for their own interest and for the interest of others. At about age 3 or 4, children usually develop curiosity about their genitals, and they commonly engage in sexual play and masturbation. That's because starting at the age of 2, children are very sensual. As according to Freud, Freud had the psychosexual stages, and he believed that the first stage was the oral stage. And he believed that the primary interest was oral during infancy. And the next stage after that would be the anal stage, and then if you recall, opal G, there's oral, anal, phallic. And so after the anal stage, which is an interest in poo, then there's the phallic stage. And so, as Freud pointed out, a lot of children suddenly discover their genitals. And so by 3 or 4, curiosity about the genitals usually develop. And masturbation and sexual play is quite common in early childhood. And there are variations in cultures in response to sexual curiosity. Many people might shame children for being interested in themselves, but we understand more now that this is actually a part of development. And they may actually outgrow it and they may not continue. It's more of just curiosity. So, that's why, I try to discourage people from like shaming somebody for being interested in their body. They should learn that their bodies are a good thing, not a dirty thing. I had a client once, for example, who was touching himself and when he was a child, and his grandmother walked in on him and shamed him vehemently. Dude, you're not supposed to do that, blah, blah. So he got the message that sexuality and his body were dirty and evil and perverted. But anytime he ever had sexual desires, he felt really guilty about it and ashamed of himself. When the reality is that this is a normal part of his body, and his body is created by God, and these are all good things. All right, so let's talk about aggression. So there are some factors that influence the development of aggression. Aggression is viewed as a natural response to anger, especially among children, because they haven't learned to develop their frontal lobe and their emotional regulation. The childhood aggression is displayed across cultures and historical periods. Not everyone is equally aggressive. It just depends on the child's temperament. And circumstances can exert a powerful influence on how children learn to manage their aggression. So there are different kinds of aggression. We have hostile aggression, which is when behavior is intended to harm others. Then there's instrumental aggression. This is behavior that's not intended to hurt another, but does so accidentally. And then there is assertiveness, when children are simply just learning to stand up for their rights. A frustration occurs when people's goals are blocked. This is common for everybody, and but especially for children, they can become very easily frustrated when they're not able to get things that they need or get what they want. And so when their goals are blocked, this can give rise to aggression or aggressive responses. Physical aggression increases at the beginning of early childhood and declines as verbal aggression replaces it. So they learn to stop being physically aggressive, but they learn how to be verbally aggressive. And some people will never outgrow that either. And so physical aggression declines. A lot of kids fight, and it's kind of normal, but hopefully they learn to use their words instead. And eventually learn not to be aggressive at all. And this is really a lot about their egocentrism, because children are focused on their own needs. They start out being selfish. They see the whole world through their own point of view, and they have a hard time understanding that other children may not see things the way they do. And that's why they have a hard time sharing. It's all about them. As egocentrism decreases, so does their aggression. So egocentrism is partly to blame for aggression, and when that goes away, then they're less aggressive. Then they grow out of it. Let's look at the role of environment. The environment plays a role in either punishing or modeling behavior. Aggressive behavior, as we know from social learning, can be influenced by punishment or modeling. And punishment can unfortunately inadvertently create aggressive behavior, especially if the punishment is harsh or frequent. And sometimes punishments even model aggressive behavior. That's one of the arguments against spanking. A lot of people believe that spanking actually just teaches children how to be aggressive and to be more aggressive. And so there is a link between harsh physical punishment and aggression. Now, just to be clear, there's some controversy about the research on spanking. Some people believe that sometimes the research is a little overstated, especially since all forms of aggression are lumped together with all forms of spanking. But I think the thing that is very clear is that when parents are harsh and frequent about their physical punishment, it's definitely going to create aggression in children. So parents want to think about other ways to reinforce good behavior and to hold them accountable besides just using physical punishment, and especially not being impulsive about it. That's why I'm saying the context of the punishment is very important. And they also want to model good behavior as well and teach them proactively about good behavior. That leads us to the subject of media and violence. Just like we might learn from our parents, we also learn about violence and aggression from the media. Powerful models are presented in the media, such as radio, video games, the internet, and TV. And the most pervasive form of media still is television, although that might appear on different forms of technology, whether it's a laptop or TV, but television, broadcast television, is still the most pervasive form of media, and that teaches children about violence. 70% of U.S. children have a TV in their bedroom, and so if that's the case, they're going to be very exposed to a lot of things in the media. According to the data, children age 8 and under spend 4 times as many minutes with video media than they do being read to, which is really sad. If we really want to, this raises concerns about what this media exposure means for their development. If we want to counteract negative media messages, then that means we need to be more involved with our children, whether it's reading to them, and encouraging other things that can be an influence on them. Exposure. Let's talk about the role, though, of the environment. So, 99% of all U.S. children, like I said, well, the previous slide said, 70%? But the reality is that the vast majority of children have TVs in their home. Well, it's 90% or whatever. And this has been linked to aggressive behavior as well as obesity, and this idea of the eye brain is that we're constantly our brains are constantly addicted to the internet and thinking about what's going on online. It's a virtual reality, essentially, that we're living in. There's also a wide-ranging influence of TV and other media that continues to be a focus of development and developmental research. The exposure to media violence is often linked because it leads children to see violence as commonplace and desensitizes children to its effect. Media can reinforce stereotypes and prejudice towards groups of people. On the other hand, children's programming can also teach some pro-social behavior. So there's a meta-analysis on the link between media violence, and it shows violent media and aggressiveness, and it shows but a small impact on aggression in children. So there's some debate. Some people think that this idea of violent media is overinflated. However, some still argue that there is still a link between violent media and aggressiveness, including the U.S. Surgeon General, the APA, and the National Institutes of Health, and the American Academy of Pediatrics. In my opinion, it's because when you get older, you learn to separate reality from fantasy or imagination. But young children are not able to separate reality from fantasy. They're not able to do that, which is why children are more susceptible to violent media when they haven't developed that capacity yet. So that's why we have TV ratings. We don't show children violent media because we're not able to differentiate between reality and fantasy. But violence is not the only problematic behavior depicted on TV. There's other things like sexuality and things like that they may not be ready for either. On the other hand, children's programming can teach some pro-social behaviors. So let's talk about pro-social behavior. Pro-social behavior, which includes positive social skills and a sense of empathy, begins to develop at about age 2 years. And this is pro-social behavior is supported by secure attachment with children. Children must learn to further develop their pro-social behaviors, and these develop in an environmental context. Developmental conflicts also arise as children learn to adjust to their own changing needs. So, of course, they're going to have conflicts, but learning to adjust is part of having pro-social behavior and learning to communicate and that sort of thing. So pro-social behaviors are actions intended to benefit others. It includes comforting, sympathizing, assisting, sharing, cooperating, rescuing, protecting, and defending. When it's fully developed, it's accompanied by feelings of friendship, caring, and warmth. Signs of empathy are linked to prosocial behavior. So empathy, the development of empathy is very important for developing children who do prosocial behavior. Prosocial simply means good behavior. And it may be displayed in children as young as 2. And the most important people are parents and siblings, and especially when they have that secure attachment between the child and their parents. So this, as I said, this can be encouraged by exposing children to models who develop positive behaviors, especially if empathy is involved and the model has a good relationship with the child. So parents teach children how to have prosocial behavior and how to empathize. So what are some of the roots of prosocial behavior? In the United States, culture and family play a large role. In the United States, competitiveness is highly valued. And U.S. children become less cooperative and more competitive as they grow older. Mexican children are more likely to cooperate as they age. So it's a little different for children of other cultures. Like Mexican children are more likely to coordinate work, whereas U.S. children are more likely to work alone. So that's probably because they're maybe more a little collectivistic, whereas U.S. children are more individualistic. So they're more likely to cooperate and coordinate if the children from Mexico, whereas children in the U.S. are very competitive and they work alone. And so this may be one of the things that contributes to whether or not children are going to be engaging in prosocial behavior. So if you were to think about it, how can we encourage children to engage in prosocial behavior? Also, encouraging children to role play can actually, let's talk about that. So, studies have demonstrated the influence of modeling on prosocial behavior. Children who witness an act of generosity, for example, become more generous themselves. This is all part of the theory, social learning theory. If you recall Albert Bandura's social learning experiment with the Bobo doll, they discovered that aggressiveness can be learned. But the same thing with prosocial behavior. So then the question we must ask is, how can we encourage prosocial behavioral development in children? And that may be largely due to modeling. How do we model it? So encouraging children to role play can help them understand others' feelings as well, and help them increase their empathy. Helps them to develop those mirror neurons because they learn to take on the perspective of others. And this is also encouraged to rewarding prosocial behavior as well. Okay, so let's talk about developmental conflicts. Developmental conflicts are conflicts at each stage of development. Erik Erikson, if you recall, came up with this list of stages that children must go through, and these might be considered developmental conflicts. So the challenge for a 2-year-old is to develop autonomy without triggering feelings of shame and doubt. So if you recall, the first stage is about intimacy and trust. A 2-year-old is interested in developing a sense of autonomy without being shamed and without experiencing doubt. So on one hand, they still depend on their parents, but on the other hand, they have a desire for independence. So this dependence on their parents contrasts with their desire for independence. So it creates this conflict between their desire to be autonomous versus their desire to be independent. Children who are successful in doing things for themselves, learning to be autonomous, helps them to develop the self-confidence. And on the other hand, if efforts at autonomy are frustrated by criticism or constant punishment, they're more likely to feel ashamed of themselves. So this is going to trigger the shame and doubt instead of their sense of autonomy. So the development of autonomy and initiative is intertwined. If they want to, be able to initiate, explore their environment and take risks, it also means they have to have a sense of autonomy. In order to do that, they need to be encouraged. And when they make mistakes, we don't shame them for it. We might applaud them for taking a step and trying new things. So this stage is known as initiative versus guilt. The key to a healthy balance in early childhood is, let's talk about that. So this really is the third stage of development. And so, as I said, this is the third one. The second one was what? That was the need and a sense of autonomy. So if you remember, the infant wants a sense of trust. This 2-year-old wants a sense of autonomy. But then building on the autonomy is that sense of initiative. As I said, if they don't feel like they have a sense of autonomy where they are not clinging and dependent, then they're not going to take initiatives. They're only going to take initiative when they know that it's okay to be autonomous. So initiative really depends on the previous stage, which is autonomy. So in Erikson's theory, 3 to 6-year-old children's primary developmental conflict focuses on the development of mastery and competence. This is the third phase, known as initiative versus guilt. So this is the primary developmental conflict for 3 to 6-year-olds. And initiative refers to the purposefulness of young children. And so the key to healthy development in early childhood is to achieve a balance between initiative versus guilt. Guilt is aroused by the child's conscience when his or her behavior violates social or moral standards. So they're going to make mistakes, and that's okay. But parents who discourage the child's curiosity or exploration, or who set unrealistic high expectations, contribute to feelings of guilt, and it discourages their development of initiative. And these children may end up being overly passive or anxious and may even exhibit aggression due to their frustration or not being able to know how to get their needs met. Okay, so there are limits to independence. The limits to independence result in feeling passive or aggressive. And chronically ill or physically disabled children may have limited abilities to become independent because they are always going to be dependent on somebody. And children in dangerous surroundings are also going to be dependent on their parents, so they're not going to be able to be independent. So limited children, unfortunately, fail to engage with the process of learning. They need to have this opportunity to explore their environment. And the potential for development unfortunately, it also has the potential for the development of destructive or aggressive behavior when they're not able to assert themselves and explore and develop their sense of autonomy. Okay, and peers and children provide each other emotional support, and they serve as models for each other's behavior, and they engage in and encourage complex imaginative play. So we're going to talk about play. Play is very important. As some people believe, play is the work of children. It's the primary outlet for their energy, and it gives them the context to explore, create, and develop their social and intellectual skills. So play is very important. And children go through stages of learning how to play. They start out playing on their own. This is solitary play. Then they watch others play. And then parallel play is when they learn to play next to other children. And the associative play was when they start to play with each other. And cooperative play is when they are playing together and being friendly at the same time. As children develop, their play becomes more social. And at about age 4 years of age, children begin to engage in social pretend play, which involves the use of imagination and the sharing of fantasies or using agreed upon rules. So they can play doctor, they can play house, they can play the kitchen, cooking in the kitchen, or playing going to school and that sort of thing. Many children have imaginary companions, which are invisible companions that children create and pretend are real. These children tend to be less shy and more creative, and they have more friends. So it's good for them to have imaginary companions. It teaches them how to have social skills. Some children also develop more social competence, the ability to initiate and maintain satisfying reciprocal relationships with peers, and are thus more popular with others. So when they become more socially competent, they become more popular. And imaginary companions help them to develop social skills, and which give them that sense of competence. Of course, there's going to be cultural differences in the kinds of things that they do. By age of 5 or 6, social competence is well established and typically stable throughout the life. Factors that facilitate this are the ability to regulate emotions. So again, that goes back to what we talked about earlier. A major developmental component in this stage is their ability to regulate emotions. And when they're able to regulate their emotions, it helps them to be able to manage their relationships and be socially competent. Otherwise, if they can't manage their emotions, then they're going to be rejected. Unpopular children typically are more aggressive and thus they're more withdrawn from others. So if they want their children to be popular, they have to be socially competent. And social competence depends a lot on their ability to regulate their emotions. Okay, so this is a list of social behavior. Children are more likely to be popular if certain behaviors are displayed. And all of these things require the ability to regulate their emotions. So now how do you think young children become socially competent? And if you were to reflect on that, and what are the developmental pathways involved in becoming socially competent? Is there one way? Is there one path? There are actually multiple factors that can play a role in social competence. But there's also some factors that limit their social popularity and their social competence. If they've been abused or neglected, that can inhibit their social competence and make them unpopular because they don't know how to relate to others. They're reacting from their pain. Being overly sheltered by their parents can create unpopularity. Not being able to control their emotions and being aggressive will also be challenging. Being different means that they have a hard time relating to others, or they feel like and look like they're different. That can also create challenges to being accepted. So, and then being off to a bad start at the beginning of the school year can also just do it. And if you're a parent of a child, how can you help your children to establish positive social skills? Well, we can teach them social skills through modeling and encouragement. We can also create opportunities for their social experiences, and we can also provide opportunities for them to play with other children, which is good for their social skills. If they're always by themselves, that may not be good. Internalization is essential to the development of social competence, where children incorporate the values and moral standards of their society and their understanding of themselves. So when they're around other people, they start internalizing the values of society. And that's because we imitate the values and we imitate the behaviors of other people. Children do not acquire a clear understanding of friendship until about middle childhood. And so prior to that, they just talk to others, but they don't necessarily have friends. Young children behave differently with their friends than with strangers, which is good. And children demonstrate a growing social awareness when they engage in arguments, so that that might help them to learn more about what other people think, because prior to that they were always egocentric. So when through the conflict, even though we think of conflict as a bad thing, it helps them to really become aware of what other people think, and it helps them to understand the values of the people around them. And as their knowledge of the social context expand deeper, they have more personal relationships with their peers. Okay, so as we know, when we interact with others, it helps us form our sense of self. And we assemble various specific behaviors to create overall patterns of behavior, which forms the basis of our self-concept. As children grow older, they develop their self-concept. That means they also become more likely to see themselves and others as having stable character attributes. So by 21 months, for example, it's about less than 2 years, they start to recognize themselves in the mirror. Then their language may contain assertions of possession like me, my, and mine. They learn that they can own this. This is mine. And their self-understanding is closely linked to understanding the social world. This is very, connected. understanding themselves also helps them to regulate their emotions and their behavior. If they don't know why they're angry, then it's going to be hard to stop being angry. And part of the way we help them to learn that self-understanding is by being accepting and modeling empathy. So children who are more social generally have more developed self-concepts because of that interaction with others. As children bring their view of themselves and their behavior into alignment, they develop attitudes about themselves that often reflect what others think about them. That's because we have like a mirror sense of self. Our sense of self is reflected in how other people see us. Cooley called it the looking glass sense of self. Another major component of development at this time period is the idea of gender identity. They start to learn that what their gender is. Let's talk about some of these concepts. First, the term sex, when used by psychologists, refers to the genetic and biological determinations of being male and female. However, gender is a person's conceptual understanding of being male or female, which is largely defined by culture. So that's the difference between sex and gender. Sex is in the anatomy, the genitals, whereas gender is in the mind. People's knowledge of who they are as male or female is part of their gender identity, and which results from the interaction of biology and environmental forces. And the environment helps us to understand what it means to be male or female. There is an interaction between biology and gender, or biology and environment that helps us determine our gender roles. So, as they might develop differently, that's going to reinforce different ideas. So they're going to see themselves differently. Whereas in the beginning, babies don't see themselves as a boy or a girl. They only start to discover that as they get older and start to experience their differences. The development of gender identity results from many forces. And so how do you think children acquire their sense of gender identity? Something to think about. Male and female differences emerge during early childhood, and these differences include those that are biologically programmed, as well as those that are learned from the society and the family as well. Research has demonstrated that most gender differences are not actually real, they're more socialized. And so there are no really consistent gender differences in sociability, self-esteem, motivation to achieve, or even rote learning and certain analytical skills, even though that has been previously thought of. That now we understand that the differences that were previously identified are shrinking and roles are becoming more and more flexible. So differences between boys and girls have existed from birth. So there's obviously some gender differences that may be attributed to based on nurture. However, cultural roles tend to exaggerate gender stereotyped behaviors. So, and especially in the US, our culture is becoming much more flexible in defining what is gender appropriate behavior. So, as I said, whereas biology might have created some small differences, society tends to reinforce these differences and make them bigger than they really are, and create stereotypes that are about what it means to be a man or woman. Thankfully, we're becoming more flexible about these things. Androgyny is this view that all people are capable of developing a wide range of traits, and that masculine and feminine are not at opposite ends of the spectrum. Rather, they are two separate dimensions, and a person can be high or low on either scale. Someone can be neither masculine or feminine, or they can be a little of both. A blend of feminine and masculine traits is referred to as an androgynous personality. What is androgyny anyway? Androgyny comes from the two different words, andros and gynes, which means, or gynekos, or something like that. I think it's a Greek word that means female. So it literally means male and female. So a blend of those, androgynous literally means male and female. They're not one or the other. And most U.S. children still hold fairly traditional concepts about gender. They latch on to these gender differences too. And they like talking about gender. By age 2.5, most children can label people as boys or girls. They don't call them men or women. They oftentimes say boy or girl. And they can answer the question, are you a boy or girl? They can give you an answer. Children may be confused about what the distinction is between a man and woman and what that means. And as I said before, children oftentimes reinforce or rigidly conform to these gender role stereotypes. But that's normal. The development of gender schemes depends in part on the child's level of cognitive development. They also have to have a concept of gender constancy. Gender constancy is this idea that you're always going to be a boy or always going to be a girl. You can't change your gender, even though that's hard for them to understand early on. So as I said, they developed this idea of gender roles. Gender roles are rigid ideas about what it means to be a man or male or female. Gender identity develops in predictable ways. First, children learn to label people as a boy or a girl. And they may be confused about the meaning of what it means to be a boy or girl. And they still haven't developed gender constancy. They may believe that gender is changed by surface appearance. For example, changing clothes would change gender. Second, children develop definitions of what traits are associated with gender. And so they start to understand that they're constant. The development of gender schemes depends largely on cognitive development, as we mentioned earlier. So they have to have an idea of a symbol of male or female, the symbolic representation in their head, and that's a scheme. Gender constancy, this idea that gender is stable and permanent, usually does not develop until they're about age 5. And this is the older child's understanding that a person's gender is stable and stays the same despite changes in superficial appearance. That I can dress up a girl, dress up as a woman, but I'm still a man. I'm always going to be that way. And so they start to understand that boys grow up to become daddies or men, and girls grow up to become mommies or women. That's also part of that. They're not going to change when they get older. They're going to be just an older version. And they understand that gender is consistent over time and situations. So as I mentioned earlier, children really latch onto their gender and they can reinforce their own stereotypes. This is the process of self-socialization. This implies that children are intrinsically motivated to acquire the values, interests, and behaviors associated with their gender. They take pride in their gender and they want to be that. And so there is a process of going to developing their gender identity. They're going to see rewards, punishments, modeling, all related to gender beginning early in childhood. They're going to hear indirect messages that are conveyed to them by their caregivers that shape their self-perceptions and their identity. And we also know that fathers play a particularly important influence on children establishing their gender roles. It seems that fathers are more likely to teach gender roles. However, both parents and other family members are influential in influencing gender identity as well. But as we can see, both parents are important to that. Okay, so let's just talk briefly about family dynamics. We'll just skim over some of this. But what I really want you to know is you should be able to evaluate the effects of family dynamics on early childhood development, particularly parenting styles and child maltreatment. Those are two main things you need to know. So there are 4 ways, generally, that family dynamics affect early childhood development. First one is parenting styles, then the number and space in the children, the birth order, the interaction among siblings, and then parenting techniques and the use of discipline. So there are 4 parenting styles. You should know what they are. The first one is authoritative, and then there's authoritarian, and permissive, and indifferent. And these can all be placed on 2 axes, the 2 axes of control versus warmth. Ideally, you want to have, a little of both. You don't want to be, if you have high control but no warmth, then you're just basically authoritarian. If you're high warmth but no control, you're basically permissive. If you have no warmth and no control, then you're indifferent. And on the other hand, if you have high warmth and high control, you're authoritative. Authoritative is different from authoritarian. Authoritarian means you are just controlling dictator. Authoritative means that you have authority, but it comes naturally. It comes because of you have that relationship, the warm relationship with your child. All of these have effects on the child's development. Authoritative parenting, which is the ideal parenting style, results in children who are more likely to be self-reliant, self-controlled, and socially competent. Children of authoritarian parents who are highly controlling tend to be withdrawn, fearful, dependent, moody, unassertive, and irritable, and may become rebellious and act out later. On the flip side of that, children of permissive parents may become rebellious and self-indulgent, impulsive, and socially inept because they haven't learned to control themselves. There's no parent ever teaching them discipline. On the other hand, some may end up becoming active, outgoing, and very creative. Children of indifferent parenting tend to have the worst outcomes because they have neither discipline or the feeling that somebody cares about them. So these children show high expression of destructive impulses. Discipline, of course, is important, and conflicts with children will develop with any parenting style. So regardless of what parenting style you have, there's always going to be some conflict. There's common methods of disciplining that have varied across historical periods and cultures. The most productive disciplinary techniques tend to involve setting rules that are fairly enforced, establishing a warm and consistent environment, and keeping two-way communication as open as possible. So that a lot of parents want to know how to be effective disciplinarians, and so the keys are to provide a safe and loving environment, provide explanations, not just rules. They deserve to understand the rules. If you just try to approach it based on rules and you're being authoritarian, they want to know why, because that respects them. Being consistent also shows that you're trying to be fair and not being arbitrary. Then providing realistic feedback helps them to understand how to comply. Unfortunately, a lot of parents rely heavily on bribes, like giving food or letting them watch TV, and that just teaches children that that the default of that it's okay to wait until they're bribed. If you rely on reinforcement, then they're only going to do the positive things when they are bribed. And then the other thing is you want to try and avoid physical punishment and stay calm. The main thing is being calm too. If you lash out and get aggressive with your child, it just teaches them that it's okay it's okay to get aggressive back, and it teaches them the wrong behavior. It models for them impatience and that sort of thing. So by staying calm, you're teaching them how to be patient and how not to get aggressive. So you're being a role model. And so the idea is you want to be a good role model. Also, when you are patient and you're practicing self-control, you teach your child to practice emotional self-control. The goal of discipline really should be to help children establish their own self-control that's not reliant on the parent telling them how to be. Parents who help their child to think through their emotions and express them constructively have the most positive effect. The key is to make an emotional connection with their children and to be warm. If you're just telling them and you're snapping at them, they're not really teaching them how to control their emotions. They're just learning from you how to get angry. Children who can cope emotionally tend to have longer attention spans, higher scores on reading and math tests, and fewer behavioral problems, and they also have lower heart rates as well. That means they're calmer. Another thing is you want to help them to develop self-control, and because this helps them to become more fully involved in relationships in the family. And one of the things you can do is help establish shared goals. Rather than telling them this is how it is, help them to come to a common understanding between the parents and children about how family interactions should be conducted and what their outcomes will be. So you say, if you do this, this is what's going to happen. If you don't do this, this is what's going to happen. And usually this helps create a harmonious atmosphere. Also, talking about goals, it creates a shared goals, helps to enhance the degree of intimacy. And shared goals simply means, you assume that the child wants to be good, and you're reinforcing them wanting to do that. These kinds of interactions are stable and rewarding, and families who are unable to achieve shared goals oftentimes have to negotiate everything. So, you want to be able to have some shared goals. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but sibling dynamics also play a large role in development. We don't realize, we used to think that parents were the only influence on children, but now we understand that siblings also play a role in the development of secure attachment. Sibling attachments may be just as strong as child-parent attachments. And siblings raised in the same family are likely to have very different personalities. So they might have distinct personalities and different identities, which can also result in conflict. So teaching them how to be in harmony with each other despite their differences also will have lasting effects when they get into adulthood. Birth order also plays a role. So for example, if you're an older child, you tend to end up with more responsibilities. Firstborn children may benefit from all the parents' attention, whereas the rest of the children have to share attention when later children. Younger siblings may have physical advantages. They may have better overall mental health because they have more other siblings to interact with. Unfortunately, they may also feel like they end up having to share a lot of attention. Although the youngest sometimes they get to be babied a lot, so that may also make them feel entitled as well, like other people will take care of them. Nevertheless, second-born children tend to have better social skills because they have someone else to interact with. It teaches them how to socialize. The more children in a family, the lower their IQs tend to be. Why is that? Well, it's probably due to socioeconomic factors. Mainly because if you have a lot of children, you don't have as much money to encourage and foster their growth, as well as you may not be able to have as much individual undivided attention. The link between large families and low achievement was much weaker in societies with strong public support for childcare. So in societies where there's a lot of universal childcare and universal child benefits, that might help to give children more attention. Okay, in the last section, we want to talk about maltreatment. Maltreatment is a general term that covers any act or failure to act on the part of a caregiver that results in death, serious physical or emotional harm, or sexual abuse or exploitation of a child. So it's a catch-all term for abuse or neglect of a child. And this has effects on child development. So maltreatment is not uncommon in the United States. It's very common. About 3.6 million reports of child abuse or neglect each year. That involves 6.6 million children in general. Caseworkers investigate these circumstances and they determine if a formal response is appropriate. In many cases, of the 3.4 million cases reported, 1.4 million are dismissed for lack of evidence, and 2.2 million were serious enough to warrant a response. 20% of these cases oftentimes end in criminal charges. Now, that's just to show that, first of all, it doesn't mean that most cases are not unfounded. It just means that oftentimes there's just so many reports that they have to go with the reports that have the most likelihood of being prosecuted. And also there's sometimes you can't prove something, and you can't discipline families if there's no hard evidence sometimes. And a lot of times when it comes to abuse, it's just really hard to prove. So they might just say, there's nothing they can do, but they'll put it in their database until something else comes up. That's why it's still important to report it, because even if there's no action, having it on record might show a trend if there's another incident reported later. Youngest children tend to be the most likely abused. Children under 1 were victimized at a rate of 24.4 cases per 1,000 children. That's pretty sad. That means infants are victimized. About 2% of infants tend to be victimized. That's infants under the age of 1. Boys are more likely to experience maltreatment at younger ages, whereas girls are more likely to get maltreatment at older ages. And that could be due to different factors, like boys may be more active and more likely to get in trouble, thus more likely to be abused, whereas girls are more likely to be sexually abused as they go into puberty. Boys can also be sexually abused too. That's just something you should know. Maybe not as much, but they do get abused as well. African American children also experience the highest levels of abuse, reflecting unequal socioeconomic circumstances. So if the families have more stress because they have less money, they're more likely to, and they have less opportunities for parents to be around, they're more likely to get into trouble and more likely to experience abuse. Parents most likely are the perpetrators of maltreatment. 91% of the victims were abused by their parents, which is sad. First of all, what's the difference between abuse and neglect? We mentioned this before, but neglect is unintentional, whereas abuse is intentional. And there's different forms of abuse. There is rejection. There's a denial of emotional responsiveness, meaning if they are, they're sad. If a parent is just not attending to them and not caring about them, that's emotionally abusive. Then there's degradation, when they're constantly being belittled or insulted. Terrorization is when they're scared because of you, or when the parent is scaring them. Isolation is when they're locked up in a room by themselves, or when they're just not given any attention, and that sort of thing. Exploitation would be when they are put to work at an early age, or when they're used sexually. All these forms of child abuse can really harm a child's self-esteem, and almost irreparably sometimes. It also results in school-related problems. It creates psychological problems such as depression, alcoholism, and drug abuse, and they have more control regulating their own emotions and their behavior. It puts them at greater risk for juvenile delinquency, arrest, and even dropping out of school. And abused children may come to expect interpersonal relationships to be painful, and they may even look for relationships that are painful because that's the kind of relationships that they're used to. So they may enter into abusive adult relationships because that's what they grew up with. That shows that, abuse can be transmitted from generation to generation because hurt people. If they were abused as a child, they're more likely to abuse children when they become adults. Abusers were often abused as children. And they often have unrealistic views of what is appropriate behavior in children. That's probably because they didn't know how to be treated when they're a child, or their parents didn't model patience when they're children, so they don't know how to be patient when their children act out. Children with physical disabilities, mental disorders, or difficult temperaments may also be at risk for abuse. And abuse is more likely to occur in poverty-stricken homes. However, it's important to keep in mind that abuse can happen in any home, including the homes of the wealthy. It's just more likely in poverty-stricken homes because there's stress from family finances. Okay, I'm going to skip on. So anyway, I think that's enough to talk about. We've talked about fear and anxiety. We've talked about the importance of emotional regulation. We talked about childhood aggression. And we've talked about the development of pro-social behavior. We've talked about the role of peers and play and the development of self, and particularly their identity and their sexual and gender identity. And we talked about the role of parenting and child abuse, or how child abuse can affect their development. I hope you can join us for Chapter 8. Thank you.